Gas prices, 17 times normal. Nord Stream, blown apart on the ocean floor. Factories, shutting down across the continent. Governments, spending hundreds of billions they didn't have. In 2022, Europe's energy supply was destroyed almost overnight. Pipelines severed, market prices spiking. Countries that had spent decades addicted to cheap Russian gas were suddenly cut off with no backup plan. The world watched and waited for Europe to freeze. It didn't. The lights stayed on. The radiators stayed hot. But the factories? They went quiet, and they never came back on. This is the story everyone stopped paying attention to. The crisis that didn't end, it just went silent. And the biggest threat left standing isn't a pipeline or a dictator. It's a calm, grey afternoon in December when the wind stops blowing. How did Europe build an entire economy on a fuel it didn't control? For 2 decades, Europe ran on a simple, unspoken equation. Cheap Russian gas, plus German engineering, equals global dominance. Russia had the fuel. Germany had the factories. And both sides got rich. The entire continent's heavy industry, glass, steel, chemicals, fertilizer, was built on the assumption that gas would always be cheap. 20 euros per megawatt hour. A price so low you didn't even think about it. That wasn't just a number. It was the foundation of European competitiveness. And nobody questioned it. Germany built a direct IV drip to the Siberian gas fields. They called it Nord Stream, 1,200 kilometers of steel pipe running under the Baltic Sea. They claimed it was purely business. But it wasn't business, it was an addiction. And like all addictions, it escalated. By 2021, Russia supplied roughly 40% of Europe's natural gas. In Germany, the dependency was closer to 55%. Europe wasn't just buying gas, they were freebasing it. Then Russia invaded Crimea in 2014. And Europe's response? They didn't diversify. They didn't build LNG terminals. They built a second pipeline, Nord Stream 2. $11 billion of concrete proof that Europe believed the dealer would never cut them off. They were betting the house. And on a cold morning in February 2022, the dealer cleared the table. Why did gas prices blow up electricity prices too? The invasion of Ukraine severed the artery, and the market reacted the way markets do when supply vanishes overnight. Look at this chart. This is the TTF, the benchmark price for natural gas in Europe. In August 2022, it hit 340 euros per megawatt hour, 17 times the normal price. In human terms, a catastrophe. Imagine filling up your car and instead of 80 euros, the pump asks for 800. Now imagine you have to fill up every single day because you run a glass factory or a steel mill or a fertilizer plant. That is what happened to every heavy manufacturer on the continent. But here's what made it truly absurd. Stay with me here because this part matters. Electricity pricing has one weird rule. The last power plant needed to meet demand sets the price for all of them. Gas is usually that last plant in. So when gas went from 20 euros to 300 euros, it didn't just raise gas bills, it dragged the entire power market up with it. Cheap wind on the grid? You still paid the gas price. Nuclear plant humming along perfectly? Gas price. The entire pricing mechanism was broken. Europe was staring into the abyss. Governments had one choice: pay up or collapse. How did Europe outbid the world? And what did it cost others? Europe went shopping, and they brought the credit card. Since they couldn't get gas by pipeline, they had to get it by ship. Liquefied natural gas. LNG. You cool natural gas to minus 162 degrees. It shrinks 600 times. You load it on a tanker. You ship it across the ocean. Then you heat it back up. It is the most expensive way to move energy, but it was the only way left. It won an auction against poorer countries, and the losers went dark. Ship heading to Pakistan. Pay them double to come to Rotterdam. A cargo destined for Bangladesh. Reroute it to Spain. Bangladesh experienced rolling blackouts. Pakistan's textile factories shut down. Countries that could barely afford gas at the old price were now competing against European governments writing blank checks. Europe's crisis didn't stay in Europe. It exported suffering. Meanwhile, the infrastructure response was extraordinary. In Germany, they built floating LNG import terminals in 10 months. Projects that normally take a decade. Wilhelmshaven, Brunsbüttel, Lubmin, all operational within a year. A logistical miracle driven by pure panic. By winter 2023, gas storage was full. 95% capacity across the continent. The acute crisis was over. Europe survived. But we traded a cheap dealer for an expensive one. And that is where the real story begins. Why didn't prices normalize when the crisis ended? Here we are in 2026. No more panic. No more emergency summits. Gas prices are stable. The news has moved on. But here's the moment the market stopped making sense. European gas trades at roughly 35 to 40 euros per megawatt hour. In the United States, the equivalent price is around 8 to 10 euros. In China, it's similar. Europe pays 3 to 4 times what its competitors pay for the same molecule. If you make glass or steel or fertilizer or ceramics or aluminium, you cannot compete. It is not a strategy problem. It is not a management problem. It is mathematically impossible. Start with the symbol. BASF, the company we opened with, announced it would permanently downsize Ludwigshafen and shift investment to China, not temporarily, permanently. They are building a 10 billion euro complex in Guangdong province, the largest single investment in the company's history, and it's not in Europe. Now zoom out. BASF is not an exception. It's the flagship of a category collapse. Fertiliser production across Europe dropped by 70%, and most of it never came back. OCI shut down its ammonia plant in the Netherlands. ArcelorMittal idled blast furnaces in Bremen and Hamburg. Lanxess closed chemical plants in Germany. Sector after sector, the same story. This is deindustrialization. It's not a bang, it's a whisper. It's not a factory exploding. It's a board meeting in a quiet room where someone says, the next plant goes to Texas, or Louisiana, or Guangdong. And here is why it won't reverse. Building a chemical plant takes 5 to 7 years and costs billions. No CEO is going to commit that kind of capital on European energy prices again. The risk premium is baked in forever. Even if gas drops tomorrow, the trust is broken. Every month, Europe becomes a little lighter. A few hundred jobs here, a production line there. No dramatic headlines, just a slow, steady drain of industrial capacity to wherever energy is cheap. Can renewables replace cheap gas, even on the worst winter week? So, is it all doom? Not quite, because crisis has a way of forcing change that decades of policy never could. This crisis forced the fastest green energy transition in history. When your old fuel costs 17 times what it used to, suddenly solar panels and wind turbines look very attractive. In 2025, renewables generated more electricity in Europe than fossil fuels for the first time ever. Solar capacity doubled in 3 years. offshore wind farms are being built at a pace that would have seemed absurd a decade ago. Spain, Portugal, and Greece are becoming renewable energy superpowers. But the transition has an ugly secret, and the Germans have a word for it. Of course they do. Dunkelflaute, dark doldrums. It means no wind, no sun, no power. In November 2024, a high-pressure system parked itself over Central Europe. The wind stopped, the skies turned grey, and for days renewables virtually disappeared from the grid. German wind output collapsed to 2.8 gigawatts. Normal capacity, 19 gigawatts. Fossil fuels had to cover 70% of generation. The backup system became the main system. Then it happened again. December 2024, this time worse. This is where the line stops behaving like a line. German wholesale electricity prices spiked above €800 per megawatt hour. Some heavy industrial users simply shut down. It was cheaper to stop producing than to pay for power. And here is where it gets political. Because Germany doesn't just suffer alone during a Dunkelflaute. It reaches out and pulls power from its neighbours: France, Sweden, Norway. During that December event, German imports averaged over 10 gigawatts for days. During tight periods, Germany pulls imports hard, and Nordic prices can spike when export flows surge. Norway, a country that runs almost entirely on hydropower, watched its own electricity prices hit a 5-year record. The Scandinavians were furious, and they had a point. Germany shut down its nuclear plants, bet everything on wind and solar, and now when the weather doesn't cooperate, it imports the problem to everyone else. This is the uncomfortable truth about the green transition. On average, renewables are winning. On the worst days, they vanish completely. And Europe still doesn't have enough energy storage to bridge the gap. On a calm, cloudy winter evening, you still need gas. And gas is still expensive. Then there's the nuclear question. France kept its reactors running and came through the crisis in better shape than almost anyone. During every Dunkelflaute, French nuclear exports kept the lights on across the continent. Germany and Belgium shut their reactors down, right in the middle of an energy crisis. Whether you love nuclear or hate it, the timing was hard to defend. The honest picture is this: Europe is getting cleaner. The carbon numbers are moving in the right direction, but Europe is also getting less competitive. The energy-intensive industries that paid the taxes, employed the workers, and built the middle class. They're leaving, and renewables, as good as they are, cannot yet replace cheap pipeline gas for heavy industry. Not on a sunny Tuesday. And definitely not during a Dunkelflaute in December. We are in a transition, but transitions have costs, and Europe is paying them right now. So, was it worth it? Europe has broken the chains of Russian dependency. That vulnerability, the one that let a single dictator hold an entire continent hostage, is gone. We are sovereign again. That matters. But the price of sovereignty is a smaller economy, a weaker industrial base, higher bills for every household and every business with no clear end date. The era of cheap European manufacturing is dead. The Europe of 2030 will be a service economy, a tech economy, maybe even a green superpower. We survived the cold. Now, we have to survive the cost. But the smokestacks, the blast furnaces, the chemical plants that made this continent an industrial giant for 150 years, they're never turning back on.